"Stop! You're waking the walls," the homeless black boy said quietly, and every voice inside the underground chamber fell away at once. The sentence sounded absurd, almost childish, until the ancient stone beneath everyone's feet answered with a low vibration that rolled through the excavation site like distant thunder. More than 30 archaeologists, linguists, historians, and museum officials stood frozen beneath the soft glow of suspended work lights, their faces washed pale against weathered limestone that had remained hidden for nearly 2,000 years beneath the hills outside Santa Fe, New Mexico. Cameras streamed every second to universities across the country. Reporters pressed against the security barriers above. A discovery already being called the greatest archaeological breakthrough in a generation had suddenly become something no one could explain. At the center of the chamber rested a weathered document sealed inside a crystal display case, its surface covered in elegant symbols unlike any known writing system. For 72 straight hours, the world's leading experts had argued, translated, scanned, compared, and debated every line without reaching a single conclusion. Artificial intelligence models failed to identify the language. Ancient language databases produced no meaningful match. Every attempt ended the same way, with uncertainty replacing confidence. Dr. Nathaniel Whitmore folded his arms tightly across his expensive field jacket as he stared at the document again. For nearly 30 years, he had built his reputation solving impossible historical mysteries. Television networks called him America's greatest living archaeologist. Students quoted his books. Museums competed for his lectures. Failure was not a word that comfortably belonged beside his name. Yet this document refused to surrender its secrets. Around him, assistants adjusted scanners, while specialists whispered increasingly frustrated theories. Some insisted the symbols represented mathematics. Others believed they were ceremonial markings rather than language. Every opinion contradicted the one before it. The atmosphere inside the chamber grew heavier with every passing minute, carrying the stale scent of limestone dust, old parchment, and overheated electronics. Then someone noticed movement beyond the temporary security fence. A skinny teenage boy wearing a faded gray hoodie stood near the entrance, quietly watching the room with calm, patient eyes. His backpack looked older than he was. His worn sneakers carried the pale dust of countless sidewalks. Security had already asked him twice to leave the public observation area, but somehow he had wandered close enough to hear the arguments echoing through the chamber. One guard sighed as he approached again. "Kid, this isn't a shelter. Time to move along." The boy nodded politely without taking his eyes off the document. "I'm leaving," he answered softly. "I just wanted to hear it one more time." The guard frowned. "Hear what?" The boy tilted his head toward the display case. "They're saying the sound's wrong." Nearby researchers exchanged amused glances. One young assistant let out a quiet laugh before returning to her tablet. Another whispered something about internet conspiracy videos. No one expected another word from the teenager. Dr. Whitmore barely acknowledged his presence. To him, the boy blended into the background like countless curious visitors who wandered through museum exhibits every year, believing they possessed hidden insight. The archaeologist stepped closer to the document and carefully repeated another attempted pronunciation, supplied moments earlier by a language specialist from Boston. The unfamiliar syllables echoed awkwardly across the chamber before dissolving into silence. The teenage boy closed his eyes for only a second. Then he slowly shook his head. "No," he whispered almost to himself. "That's backwards." This time several people turned toward him. Dr. Whitmore's expression hardened with restrained irritation. "Young man," he called, keeping his professional tone carefully measured. "These scholars have spent decades studying ancient civilizations. This isn't something you simply guess." The boy finally looked directly at him. There was no challenge in his face, no arrogance, only quiet certainty. "I'm not guessing," he replied. "You're trying to read it like words. It isn't words." A few researchers smiled politely, convinced the interruption was over. One technician resumed adjusting a laser scanner. Another checked live translation software. The chamber returned to its rhythm for barely a heartbeat before the boy spoke again, his voice scarcely louder than the whisper of circulating air. "It's a song." The silence lingered so completely that even the steady hum of the portable generators seemed to fade into the stone. Several of the researchers exchanged uncertain looks, unsure whether to laugh or dismiss the strange comment altogether. Dr. Nathaniel Whitmore studied the boy for another long moment before speaking. "A song?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. "Ancient legal records are not songs." The teenager lowered his eyes toward the fragile document, resting beneath the protective glass. "Maybe not to us," he answered quietly. "But whoever wrote it wanted people to remember it, not just read it." Before anyone could respond, another security officer stepped forward and gently rested a hand near the boy's shoulder. "Come on, son. You have to leave the restricted area." The boy nodded without argument. He had learned years ago that resisting only made people stop listening even sooner. He turned away from the chamber and disappeared through the temporary tunnel leading toward the bright desert sunlight above. Within seconds, the excavation returned to its routine, yet something subtle had changed. More than one scholar found themselves staring at the document instead of their notes, wondering why such a simple sentence refused to leave their minds. Outside, the afternoon sun stretched across the red sandstone cliffs surrounding the archaeological site. Heat shimmered above the gravel access road, while dusty pickup trucks and television vans lined the temporary parking area. The boy walked slowly past them, with his faded backpack hanging loosely from one shoulder. His name was Elijah Brooks. He was 16 years old, although most people guessed he was younger because years of uncertainty had left him thin and quiet. Every possession he owned fit inside the worn backpack that rarely left his side. A rolled blanket, 2 changes of clothes, a battered water bottle, a small flashlight, and a weathered leather notebook with cracked corners that looked far older than anything else he carried. Elijah had never thought of himself as homeless. Homeless sounded temporary, like someone waiting for another address. He had stopped waiting a long time ago. Since losing the apartment he had once shared with his grandmother, every public library, church courtyard, bus station, and community shelter had become another place to continue the routine she taught him before she passed away. "Never let your mind become as empty as your pockets," she used to tell him whenever life became difficult. Those words had stayed with him longer than any building ever had. Every morning began the same way. Before sunrise, he folded his blanket, washed up wherever clean water was available, and walked to the downtown public library the moment its doors opened. The librarians knew him well enough to greet him by name, but never ask questions that might embarrass him. Elijah spent hours reading books that most visitors ignored. Ancient civilizations, comparative linguistics, oral traditions, forgotten alphabets, religious hymns, musical notation from cultures that no longer existed. He copied page after page into his leather notebook using careful handwriting that almost looked printed. He rarely borrowed books because he had nowhere safe to keep them overnight. Instead, he memorized entire chapters before closing the covers and returning them to the shelves. Some afternoons he earned enough money helping tourists carry luggage near the train station or cleaning storefront windows for local businesses. Other days he collected discarded books from donation bins, searching for damaged history texts that no one else wanted. More than once he had rescued missing pages from recycling containers simply because they contained fragments of ancient languages. To most people, they looked like worthless scraps of paper. To Elijah, they felt like voices waiting for someone willing to listen. The leather notebook always remained closest to his heart. Inside were hundreds of handwritten symbols, songs, pronunciation guides, and stories collected from years of patient study. Many pages had originally belonged to his grandmother, Ruth Brooks, who had worked as a volunteer storyteller at cultural museums before illness forced her to stop. She believed history survived longest when spoken aloud, rather than silently admired behind glass. Instead of asking Elijah to memorize dates, she sang old words until they became melodies he could never forget. Whenever they encountered an unfamiliar language in one of her library books, she encouraged him to imagine how it might have sounded before imagining what it meant. Every forgotten language was once someone's favorite song, she would whisper with a warm smile. As Elijah reached the edge of the excavation parking lot, he paused beside a weathered fence overlooking the desert valley. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush across the open landscape, while distant thunderclouds gathered beyond the mountains. He carefully removed the leather notebook from his backpack and opened it to a page filled with flowing symbols remarkably similar to those he had just seen beneath the mountain. His fingertips rested gently against the faded ink. Then, Almost instinctively, he hummed a slow melody under his breath. The notes were soft enough that only the desert heard them. Yet somewhere beneath layers of ancient stone, something answered with another faint vibration. Back inside the excavation chamber, the strange vibration faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind nothing but uneasy silence and puzzled expressions. One technician checked the seismic monitors, expecting to find a minor tremor, but every screen remained perfectly normal. Another engineer inspected the support beams, convinced some piece of heavy equipment had shifted beneath the platform. Nothing explained what everyone had just felt. The unanswered mystery settled over the room like fine desert dust. Dr. Nathaniel Whitmore refused to let uncertainty interrupt the project. He straightened the collar of his field jacket and walked toward the center table where enlarged photographs of the document covered nearly every available surface. His movements were calm, measured, and practiced, the habits of a man who had spent decades convincing both the academic world and himself that every mystery could eventually be solved through discipline and expertise. Around him, graduate students hurried to organize fresh notes, while camera crews quietly repositioned their equipment for another round of televised analysis. Whitmore glanced once toward the tunnel where the teenage boy had disappeared before returning his attention to the document. "We proceed with evidence," he said firmly. "Not impressions, not folklore. Certainly not guesses from spectators." Several researchers nodded in agreement, relieved to hear the familiar confidence return to the room. Dr. Amelia Pierce, the lead linguistic consultant from Chicago, adjusted her glasses before speaking carefully. "Still, Nathaniel, the vibration happened immediately after the pronunciation attempt, then again after the boy mentioned a song. The timing is unusual." Whitmore folded his hands behind his back. Coincidences become legends when people are desperate for explanations. His answer carried enough authority that no one challenged him further. He had earned that influence through years of remarkable discoveries. Museums across America displayed artifacts bearing his name. Presidents had invited him to cultural advisory panels. Students memorized passages from his textbooks. He had spent an entire career proving that history belonged in careful hands, guided by scholarship instead of myth. Deep inside, however, another feeling quietly pressed against his certainty. It annoyed him that he could still hear the teenager's calm voice repeating the same sentence. "It is a song." He dismissed the thought almost immediately. There was no place for intuition inside a scientific excavation. Facts came first. Everything else followed. He motioned toward the document again. "We begin another phonetic reconstruction using the Eastern dialect hypothesis." A recording engineer activated the sensitive microphones surrounding the display case, while several language specialists prepared revised pronunciation charts. One after another, they carefully repeated combinations of reconstructed syllables into the silent chamber. Each attempt echoed beautifully against the ancient stone, before disappearing without effect. The document remained as still as it had been for centuries. The air itself seemed to resist their efforts. Hours passed beneath the bright excavation lights. Coffee grew cold on folding tables. Whiteboards filled with diagrams, arrows, and competing theories. Frustration slowly replaced confidence. Outside the chamber, news reporters continued broadcasting live updates, describing the remarkable discovery, while quietly acknowledging that even the nation's leading experts remained unable to unlock its meaning. Whitmore watched the coverage on a nearby monitor with growing discomfort. His reputation had never depended on immediate success, but public uncertainty spread faster than academic patience. He needed progress. He needed answers. During a short break, he stepped into the open desert air. The late afternoon sun painted long golden shadows across the sandstone cliffs, while a cool breeze carried the scent of sage through the valley. In the distance, he noticed the same teenage boy sitting alone beside an old wooden fence, overlooking the excavation site. Elijah Brooks appeared completely unaware that anyone was watching him. The worn leather notebook rested open across his knees while he quietly copied symbols onto another page with careful concentration. There was no audience, no attempt to impress anyone, no sign of performance, only patient study. Whitmore found himself unexpectedly curious. From this distance, the pages almost resembled the markings on the ancient document below. The thought irritated him more than it interested him. Countless enthusiasts filled notebooks with copied symbols after visiting museums or watching documentaries. That proved nothing. Yet something about the boy's complete lack of self-importance unsettled him. Elijah was not trying to be recognized. He simply behaved as though the knowledge already belonged to him. Before Whitmore could decide whether to approach, one of his assistants hurried across the gravel, carrying a newly printed analysis report. "Doctor," she called, slightly out of breath. The imaging laboratory finished another multispectral scan. Whitmore accepted the report without looking away from the distant figure. "Anything new?" The assistant hesitated before answering. "Actually, yes." The scan revealed faint guide markings beneath the visible symbols. Whitmore finally turned toward her. "Guide markings?" She nodded slowly, almost like musical notation. "We have never seen anything exactly like it before." His expression remained composed, but somewhere beneath decades of certainty, the first small crack quietly appeared. The report remained in Dr. Nathaniel Whitmore's hands long after his assistant finished speaking. He read the final sentence twice, then a third time, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his field hat. Hidden guide markings consistent with structured musical spacing. The words felt almost impossible to accept. Around him, members of the research team gathered one by one, each hoping the latest scan had finally produced a clear translation. Instead, it had only deepened the mystery. Dr. Amelia Pierce carefully studied the enlarged images displayed across a portable monitor. Thin parallel lines, nearly invisible beneath centuries of aging, stretched beneath the symbols with remarkable precision. They were too deliberate to be accidental, too consistent to be natural damage. "It almost looks like someone intended the reader to hear the document instead of simply seeing it," she murmured. Several specialists exchanged uncertain glances. One historian quietly admitted he had encountered ceremonial cultures that memorized history through rhythm rather than writing. But none had ever seen evidence preserved in quite this way. Whitmore remained silent. He disliked how closely the discovery echoed the words spoken by the homeless teenager only minutes earlier. Coincidence still seemed the most reasonable explanation, yet each new finding chipped away at that certainty. A museum representative approached carrying a satellite phone. "Doctor, the Smithsonian Board is requesting another live update in 20 minutes. They are asking whether the translation is progressing." Whitmore inhaled slowly before answering. "Tell them we have identified additional structural features. Nothing more." He refused to speculate publicly. Reputation had taught him that history rewarded patience, while headlines rewarded exaggeration. Still, as he handed back the report, his thoughts drifted once again toward the boy outside the fence. Without announcing his intention, Whitmore walked alone across the gravel path, toward the overlook where Elijah Brooks had been sitting earlier. The desert breeze had grown cooler as afternoon slowly surrendered to evening. Long shadows stretched across the canyon floor while the distant mountains glowed with soft amber light. He found Elijah exactly where he had been before, seated quietly beside the weathered fence with the leather notebook resting across his knees. The teenager looked up as Whitmore approached, but did not stand. There was no fear in his expression, only quiet respect. "You came back," Elijah said gently. Whitmore folded his arms. "I wanted to ask you something," Elijah nodded. "About the song." The archaeologist hesitated for only a moment. "You spoke as though you recognized the document immediately. Why?" Elijah carefully closed his notebook before answering. "Because my grandmother spent years teaching me that some ancient languages were never separated from music. People remembered them by singing them together. If you tried to speak the words without the melody, they stopped making sense." Whitmore studied the young face before him. "Where exactly did your grandmother learn that?" "Everywhere she could," Elijah replied with a faint smile. "Libraries, tribal elders, museum volunteers, old recordings nobody borrowed anymore. She believed forgotten voices deserved someone willing to listen." Whitmore noticed there was no attempt to impress him. Elijah answered every question with the same calm honesty he had shown inside the excavation. "Did she teach you this language?" Whitmore asked. Elijah slowly shook his head. "Not this one, but she taught me how to recognize languages that wanted to be remembered differently." The answer sounded unusual, yet somehow sincere. Before Whitmore could continue, a gust of wind lifted several loose pages from inside the notebook. One sheet drifted onto the gravel between them. Whitmore instinctively bent down to retrieve it. His eyes stopped the instant he saw the carefully drawn symbols covering the page. They were not identical to the markings inside the excavation chamber, but the flowing patterns shared unmistakable similarities. Beneath each line, Elijah had written small notes describing breathing, pauses, rising tones, and descending rhythms rather than literal definitions. It resembled the working notes of a musician more than those of a translator. Whitmore handed the page back slowly. "You wrote all of these?" Elijah nodded. "Most of them. Some came from my grandmother." The archaeologist looked toward the excavation entrance where floodlights were beginning to illuminate the site for another night of research. His radio suddenly crackled to life. "Dr. Whitmore, you need to return immediately. The environmental sensors are detecting repeated resonance inside the chamber." Whitmore acknowledged the call without taking his eyes off Elijah. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, the archaeologist made a decision that surprised even himself. "Come with me," he said quietly. "You will not touch anything. You will simply observe." Elijah slipped the notebook carefully back into his backpack and stood. "Thank you, sir." Together they walked toward the brightly lit entrance where dozens of researchers waited inside, completely unaware that the next few minutes would begin changing everything they believed about the ancient document. The moment Elijah Brooks stepped back into the excavation chamber, conversations slowed until they dissolved into complete silence. Dozens of curious eyes followed the thin teenager as though he had wandered into the wrong building by mistake. Bright construction lights reflected across polished equipment, while rows of computer screens displayed enlarged images of the ancient document waiting beneath its protective glass. The contrast between the expensive research facility and Elijah's faded hoodie could not have been sharper. One senior researcher quietly leaned toward another and whispered, "Surely he is not part of the study." Another replied with a polite smile that barely concealed his doubt. "Perhaps Dr. Whitmore wants to demonstrate something for the cameras." "Doctor." Nathaniel Whitmore ignored the comments as he walked to the center of the chamber. His voice remained calm and measured. "No one will interrupt. We are only testing an observation." Several members of the team exchanged skeptical glances, but years of working under Whitmore had taught them to respect his instructions. Elijah stopped several feet from the display case. He did not move closer. Instead, he quietly closed his eyes for a brief moment, listening rather than looking. The chamber was filled with tiny sounds that most people ignored. Air flowed gently through the ventilation ducts. Electrical equipment produced a soft mechanical hum. Dust drifted through the beams of white light hanging above the excavation. Elijah slowly opened his eyes again. "May I ask something?" he said. Whitmore nodded cautiously. "Go ahead." Elijah pointed toward the portable speakers connected to the recording equipment. "Could you turn everything off for 1 minute?" Several technicians looked confused. One of them frowned. "The scanners need continuous power." Elijah smiled politely. "Not the scanners, just the speakers. The room is too loud." A few researchers quietly chuckled. The request sounded harmless but unnecessary. "Doctor." Amelia Pierce glanced toward Whitmore before giving a small nod to the audio engineer. Within seconds, the speakers fell silent. The chamber became strangely still. The quiet seemed almost unfamiliar after hours of electronic noise. Elijah took one slow breath. His attention rested entirely on the document beneath the glass. "It is easier now," he whispered. Whitmore folded his arms. "What exactly are you listening for?" Elijah answered without looking away. "The spaces." The archaeologist frowned. "Spaces?" "The empty places between the symbols," Elijah replied. "My grandmother always said ancient singers left breathing places because no one can sing forever." Several specialists immediately looked back toward the enlarged images. The newly discovered guide markings suddenly appeared different through that perspective. Instead of decorative lines, they resembled carefully measured pauses. Dr. Pierce quietly enlarged another section on the monitor. Her eyebrows slowly lifted. "The intervals repeat," she murmured. "Not randomly. They follow a pattern." Excitement spread through the room like a ripple across still water. Researchers hurried between monitors comparing measurements, while others overlaid transparent imaging files onto the latest scans. One statistician suddenly looked up from his laptop. "The spacing is mathematically consistent," he announced. "Every fourth interval repeats the same distance." Another specialist added, "That would make perfect sense if these were musical phrases." Whitmore remained remarkably composed, yet inside he felt decades of certainty shifting beneath him. The impossible possibility was beginning to resemble evidence. Elijah remained perfectly still. "May I see the symbols without the reflection?" he asked softly. The conservation manager immediately hesitated. "Absolutely not. The protective cover cannot be removed." "I am not asking you to remove it," Elijah replied. "Only dim the lights above it." Again, the request sounded simple. Again, it revealed something none of the experts had considered. The overhead lights were reduced one level. Instantly, the reflections disappeared, allowing the faded markings to emerge with surprising clarity. Elijah smiled almost imperceptibly. "There," he whispered. "Now I can see where the song begins." A wave of murmurs swept across the chamber. One visiting professor shook his head in visible disbelief. "This is impossible." Another crossed his arms. "He is making educated guesses." A third researcher spoke more bluntly. "Someone must have coached him." Whitmore raised one hand, restoring silence. "Enough." His eyes remained fixed on Elijah. "Can you demonstrate what you mean?" Elijah looked uncertain for the first time. "I can try." "Without touching the document," Whitmore replied. Elijah nodded respectfully. He stood with his hands resting quietly at his sides. Then he inhaled slowly, exactly as though preparing to remember something rather than invent it. Every camera inside the chamber turned toward him. Every researcher stopped writing. Every monitor continued recording. The first note had not yet left Elijah's lips, but somehow everyone already sensed they were standing at the edge of a discovery far greater than anyone had expected. Elijah closed his eyes, and for several long seconds he did nothing at all. The chamber remained perfectly still, wrapped in a silence so complete that every quiet breath seemed to linger beneath the ancient stone ceiling. Then a single clear note drifted into the room. It was soft, almost fragile, yet it carried with remarkable confidence through every corner of the excavation. It did not sound like a performance. It sounded like a memory returning home after centuries of waiting. The melody rose slowly before settling into an unhurried rhythm that felt unfamiliar to modern ears but strangely natural against the weathered walls surrounding the document. No one interrupted. No one even reached for a keyboard. The researchers simply listened. Elijah continued, allowing each phrase to breathe before beginning the next. His pronunciation flowed effortlessly across sounds that none of the world's leading specialists had managed to reconstruct. There was no hesitation in his voice because he was not translating individual symbols. He was following the spaces between them exactly as his grandmother had taught him years before. The chamber itself seemed to respond. A faint resonance moved gently through the limestone floor, not loud enough to alarm anyone, only strong enough to be felt beneath their shoes like the quiet vibration of a distant church bell. Several hanging work lights trembled almost imperceptibly. Dust floated lazily through their beams, sparkling like tiny stars suspended in warm air. Dr. Amelia Pierce looked toward the environmental monitor beside her. Every sensor displayed a subtle but measurable harmonic frequency, spreading evenly through the excavation chamber. "The resonance is synchronized," she whispered, hardly believing the numbers appearing across the screen. "It is matching the vocal pattern." Another technician stared at the live waveform with wide eyes. That should not be possible. Across the room, Dr. Nathaniel Whitmore remained completely motionless. He had spent an entire career separating measurable evidence from impossible stories, yet the evidence unfolding before him refused to fit inside any explanation he had trusted for decades. His attention shifted from the instruments to Elijah himself. The teenager still stood, with his hands resting quietly at his sides, singing with neither pride nor fear. His face reflected only peaceful concentration. Whitmore suddenly remembered something Elijah had said earlier outside the excavation. Forgotten voices deserve someone willing to listen. The sentence carried entirely different weight now. As the melody continued, the enlarged digital image of the document refreshed automatically after another multispectral scan completed in the background. Gasps quietly spread across the research team. Faint markings that had appeared almost invisible before were becoming dramatically clearer on every monitor. Hidden lines emerged beneath the ancient ink, revealing graceful patterns that curved across the page with unmistakable musical structure. Dr. Pierce stepped closer to the display, hardly able to contain her astonishment. "The imaging software is separating additional layers," she said softly. "The vibration is exposing differences in the mineral pigments." Another conservator quickly compared the newest scan with earlier images. Entire sequences of guide markings had appeared where blank parchment seemed to exist only an hour before. No one claimed the song itself had magically changed the document. Instead, the carefully controlled resonance created by Elijah's steady voice appeared to help the advanced imaging equipment distinguish microscopic variations that previous scans had missed. Science and tradition were suddenly standing beside one another instead of opposing each other. Elijah gradually allowed the final note to fade into silence. The chamber remained absolutely still. Even after the melody ended, no one spoke for several seconds. It felt almost disrespectful to interrupt what everyone had just witnessed. The desert wind whispered faintly through the entrance tunnel, while the cool evening air drifted into the chamber, carrying the scent of sagebrush and rain somewhere beyond the distant mesas. Elijah slowly opened his eyes. He looked first toward the ancient document, and then toward the rows of astonished researchers surrounding him. "My grandmother used to say every old song carries two stories," he said quietly. "One belongs to the people who first sang it. The other belongs to the people willing to hear it again." His voice remained gentle, without triumph or accusation. He was simply sharing something he believed to be true. "Doctor." Whitmore lowered his gaze for a brief moment, before looking back toward the newly revealed markings glowing across the monitors. Years of certainty had begun giving way to something far more valuable than confidence: humility. And for the first time since the excavation began, he realized the greatest discovery inside the chamber might not be hidden within the ancient document alone. The stillness inside the chamber finally gave way to movement as every researcher rushed toward the monitors with renewed purpose. Keyboards clicked rapidly. Imaging software processed layer after layer of newly revealed markings while specialists compared the fresh scans against every photograph taken during the previous 3 days. What had once appeared to be isolated symbols now unfolded into carefully ordered musical phrases, each one connected by delicate guidelines that no ordinary examination had detected. The atmosphere had completely changed. Only an hour earlier, the room had been filled with certainty and frustration. Now it overflowed with curiosity. Dr. Amelia Pierce carefully overlaid the newest scans onto the original photographs before stopping abruptly. "Nathaniel," she called softly, "come look at this." Dr. Whitmore crossed the room without speaking. Amelia enlarged one section near the center of the parchment where several faded symbols had become almost perfectly visible. Beneath them rested a sequence of tiny markings unlike anything cataloged in their database. "These are not corrections," she whispered. "They are performance instructions." Another linguist leaned closer. "Like tempo markings?" Amelia nodded slowly. "Exactly. Whoever created this document expected the reader to understand both language and music at the same time." Whitmore stared at the screen in silence. For decades, he had taught students that knowledge advanced through careful observation, yet the breakthrough standing before him had only become visible after someone completely outside the academic world approached the mystery from a different direction. He slowly turned toward Elijah, who remained standing quietly near the edge of the chamber, allowing the researchers to work without drawing attention to himself. There was no excitement on the teenager's face. If anything, he seemed relieved that the document was finally beginning to reveal itself. Just then, another voice echoed through the tunnel leading into the excavation site. "Dr. Whitmore." Everyone turned toward the entrance as an older man wearing a dark field jacket hurried inside carrying a weatherproof equipment case. His silver hair was brushed neatly beneath a canvas hat, and his identification badge immediately caught the attention of the research team. Professor Samuel Adler had spent more than 40 years studying ceremonial languages preserved through oral tradition. He had been flown from Washington after hearing reports that conventional translation methods had failed. Whitmore walked forward to greet him. "Samuel, you arrived sooner than expected." Adler smiled warmly before glancing toward the illuminated document. From what I heard on the flight, I suspected time mattered. Amelia quickly summarized everything that had happened since the latest scans, including Elijah's observations, the harmonic resonance, and the newly exposed guide markings. Adler listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked toward Elijah with genuine interest rather than skepticism. "Young man," he said kindly, "would you be willing to sing the opening once more?" Elijah hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Yes, sir." The room became quiet again. This time every microphone was calibrated. Every imaging system was synchronized. Every researcher understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Elijah sang the opening phrases exactly as before, his steady voice rising gently through the chamber with the same patient rhythm. Professor Adler closed his eyes as he listened. When the final note faded into silence, he remained motionless for several seconds before opening them again. A quiet smile slowly crossed his face. "Remarkable," he whispered. "He is not merely reproducing sounds. He understands the phrasing." Several researchers leaned forward expectantly. Adler walked toward one of the enlarged displays and pointed to a sequence of symbols newly revealed by the imaging software. "This section has puzzled everyone, because you have all treated these markings as vocabulary." His finger moved slowly across the screen. "They are not vocabulary. They are breathing cues passed through generations of oral teachers. I have only encountered fragments of this tradition in remote archival recordings, and even those were incomplete." Whitmore spoke almost cautiously. "So his pronunciation is accurate?" Adler turned toward him with complete certainty. "More than accurate. This melody preserves structural elements that disappeared from recorded history centuries ago. Without it, these symbols remain incomplete forever." The chamber fell silent once more. No one reached for a keyboard. No one challenged the conclusion. Years of scholarship had prepared them to recognize evidence when it finally appeared, even if it arrived through the most unexpected messenger imaginable. Whitmore slowly looked at Elijah. The teenager stood exactly where he had been all evening, wearing the same worn hoodie, carrying the same faded backpack, saying nothing unless someone invited him to speak. The contrast could not have been greater. The least celebrated person inside the excavation had quietly solved the mystery that had humbled the most celebrated experts. As the evening light faded beyond the entrance and the first desert stars appeared above the canyon, Dr. Nathaniel Whitmore understood that history had not chosen its next chapter according to titles, reputation, or status. It had simply chosen the one person who had learned to listen before trying to be heard. For several minutes, no one moved. The researchers who had spent years building careers around certainty now stood surrounded by evidence that had arrived from the least expected source. The quiet inside the excavation chamber felt different than before. It was no longer the silence of confusion. It was the silence that follows understanding. Dr. Nathaniel Whitmore slowly walked across the limestone floor until he stood directly in front of Elijah Brooks. Every camera in the room instinctively turned toward them. Television crews sensed something important was about to happen, but none of them spoke. Even the clicking of keyboards faded away. Whitmore removed the identification badge hanging from around his neck and looked at the young man with eyes that carried far less authority than they had only a few hours earlier. They carried gratitude instead. "Elijah," he said quietly, "when I first saw you standing outside this site, I saw a homeless teenager who had wandered into a place where he did not belong. I was wrong." The words echoed gently through the chamber. No one looked away. Whitmore continued, choosing each sentence with care. "Today you reminded every one of us that knowledge is not measured by titles, salaries, offices, or reputation. Sometimes wisdom arrives carrying a backpack instead of a briefcase." Several members of the research team lowered their eyes. More than one remembered laughing softly when Elijah had asked for the speakers to be turned off. Others remembered assuming someone must have coached him. Those assumptions suddenly felt heavier than any excavation equipment surrounding them. Elijah shifted uncomfortably beneath the attention. He had never enjoyed standing at the center of a room. "I was only repeating what my grandmother taught me," he answered gently. "She would have wanted the document to be understood the right way." Professor Samuel Adler smiled warmly. "Then, your grandmother preserved something that scholars believed was gone forever." He carefully opened his notebook before turning it toward Whitmore. The melodic structure Elijah demonstrated matches fragments collected from oral archives nearly 100 years ago. We never understood their purpose because we never heard the complete tradition. Whitmore slowly nodded. Until today, Amelia Pierce stepped forward, carrying a freshly printed translation draft generated from the newly identified musical structure. The first complete phrases had finally begun appearing on the screen. Rather than legal codes or military records, the ancient document revealed itself as a ceremonial record celebrating the responsibility of preserving knowledge across generations. One translated passage immediately captured everyone's attention. It read, "The voice that remembers with humility protects what stone alone cannot keep." The room fell silent again. The words seemed almost impossibly appropriate. Whitmore looked from the translation back to Elijah. "That message survived because someone remembered how to listen," he said softly. A representative from the National Museum approached carrying an official visitor credential that had been prepared earlier for invited scholars. Without hesitation, Whitmore accepted it and placed it carefully into Elijah's hands. "This pass has no expiration date," he said. "From this day forward, every library, archive, and research room under our partnership will be open to you." Elijah looked down at the card without speaking. For someone who had spent years wondering whether he would be asked to leave every place he entered, the simple gesture carried enormous meaning. He slowly lifted his eyes. "Thank you, sir. But may I ask for something else first?" Whitmore smiled gently. "Anything." Elijah glanced around the chamber before answering. "There are children who sleep in shelters and community centers not far from here. Some of them love books just like I do. They just do not always feel welcome inside places like this. If there is anything this discovery should change, I hope it is that." The request surprised everyone. He had not asked for money. He had not asked for fame or recognition. He had asked for a door to remain open for children who had never been invited to walk through it. Whitmore felt his throat tighten. "Then that is exactly where we begin," he replied. "We will create an outreach program in your grandmother's honor. Every child who wants to learn will have a place here." Warm applause gradually filled the chamber, quiet at first, then stronger as researchers, technicians, volunteers, and museum staff joined together. Elijah smiled modestly, almost embarrassed by the attention. He held the visitor credential carefully beside the old leather notebook that had guided him through years of lonely study. In that simple moment, the distance between scholarship and compassion seemed to disappear, replaced by something far more enduring than professional achievement. It was respect, honestly earned, and freely given. 1 year later, the desert looked exactly as it always had beneath the endless New Mexico sky. Morning sunlight poured across the sandstone cliffs, warming the ancient landscape with the same quiet patience it had shown for thousands of years. The excavation site, however, had become something entirely different. Temporary fencing and construction trailers had given way to a permanent research center built beside the protected chamber. Visitors arrived from every corner of the country. Students stepped off school buses carrying notebooks instead of souvenirs. Families wandered through interactive exhibits where history was no longer presented as a collection of silent artifacts, but as living stories preserved through voices, songs, and shared memory. Near the entrance stood a bronze plaque honoring everyone who had contributed to understanding the remarkable document. The list included archaeologists, conservators, imaging specialists, linguists, tribal historians, and community volunteers. Near the bottom, in letters no larger than any of the others, appeared one simple name, Elijah Brooks. There were no titles beside it, no special description, only his name, Dr. Nathaniel Whitmore had insisted that every contributor be recognized equally because history had taught him its most important lesson. Wisdom did not announce itself through status. It revealed itself through humility. Inside the newly expanded learning center, children gathered around large wooden tables covered with maps, ancient alphabets, and carefully reproduced manuscripts. Some wore private school uniforms. Others arrived from neighborhood community programs. A few came from shelters supported by the museum's new outreach initiative. No one asked who belonged there. Every chair was filled by someone eager to learn. Along one wall rested shelves dedicated to oral traditions from cultures around the world. Above them hung a framed photograph of Ruth Brooks smiling warmly while reading to a small circle of children many years earlier. Beneath the photograph, a simple inscription read, "Every forgotten voice deserves someone willing to listen." Elijah paused in front of the picture for a moment before quietly continuing down the hallway. At 17 years old, he had grown taller, but little else about him had changed. His faded backpack still rested comfortably across one shoulder. The weathered leather notebook remained safely inside, its pages now joined by countless new observations gathered from historians, musicians, linguists, and elders who had become his teachers as much as he had become theirs. He still preferred public buses over official transportation. He still spent long afternoons inside libraries, long after organized meetings had ended. Fame had never interested him because curiosity always arrived first. As he entered one of the classrooms, laughter drifted through the open doorway. A young girl carefully sounded out unfamiliar symbols while another student softly tapped a rhythm across the table with a pencil. Professor Samuel Adler smiled as he watched them. "Remember," he told the children, "sometimes understanding begins with listening before reading." Elijah quietly took an empty seat near the back of the room. He did not interrupt the lesson. He simply listened, smiling as one child helped another find the correct rhythm without embarrassment or competition. Across the room, Dr. Amelia Pierce noticed him and gave a warm nod of recognition before returning to the students. No announcements were made. No introductions were necessary. The room had become exactly what Elijah once hoped it could be, a place where every question mattered more than every title. Later that afternoon, Dr. Nathaniel Whitmore stood alone inside the original excavation chamber. The ancient document remained protected beneath carefully controlled lighting, but it no longer felt unreachable. Soft recordings of reconstructed ceremonial melodies played gently through the exhibit, allowing visitors to experience the document as it had likely been intended generations ago. Whitmore rested one hand lightly against the observation rail and watched a group of elementary school students listening in complete silence. Their eyes reflected wonder rather than intimidation. That difference meant everything. He heard quiet footsteps behind him and turned to find Elijah preparing to leave for the evening. Neither of them spoke immediately. They simply looked toward the ancient document together. Finally, Whitmore smiled. "You were right," he said softly. Elijah looked at him with quiet curiosity. "About what?" Whitmore glanced toward the children still listening beyond the glass. "It was never just about reading the words." Elijah smiled gently. "No, sir. It never was." Outside, the evening sun settled behind the distant mesas, bathing the research center in warm golden light. The desert breeze carried faint echoes of children's voices across the open valley, blending naturally with the timeless silence of the ancient stone. Somewhere between those two sounds, the past and the future finally learned how to speak to one another, not through power, not through pride, but through kindness, humility, and the simple courage to listen.